Let's go ahead.
All right, cool. So what's up, guys? Toby. I'm going to be defending papal supremacy as it's dogmatized in the First Vatican Council. So I think when you have a conversation like this, you have to talk about the early church, right? Like this is going to be the primary focus of this discussion. And I think for several reasons, the Catholic position is far more compelling than that of the Eastern Orthodox position on this matter. So we can get into more like specifics later, but I think first of all, terminology is very important here. You're going to hear terms like primacy, you're going to hear terms like honor, because lots of texts that detail what the authorities and delegate authority in the early church use that language. So I think first of all, I'll just clarify what makes the most sense how to define these terms. So first I'll start with honor, right? So lots of people that I've debated who are Eastern Orthodox will try to say like honor does not equal authority, right? So whenever these documents and the councils say the Bishop of Rome has a special honor above all others, they say, oh, well, that doesn't actually mean authority. It just means like honor in the sense that like you honor your parents or something. But I think that this is extremely problematic for several reasons. First of all, is that in order to do that, you kind of have to rip the term out of its historical context. Like, for example, if you read Aristotle, Aristotle equates honor and authority all the time. He uses the words interchangeably. He says that somebody in a political office is in so in because they're in a place of honor. So honor necessarily means authority. And also, literally like the Ten Commandments, right? Like honor the Lord your God, honor your parents, all of these things. Honor is used interchangeably with authority. So I think to dismiss honor entirely as just something that's meaningless, right? I think is ridiculous because of that. So now I guess I'll talk about the other language that's used. So there's another common wording that's used that's like first among equals, right? You probably heard this. Like some of the fathers will say Rome is the first among equals, and people will be like, oh well, equals, right? That means that all the bishops have equal power or whatever. But I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the term. First among equals originates from Roman times, and it was used in the Senate to designate who the head senator was, like whoever the most experienced senator was who would get to speak first and with authority on issues. And that title was actually later adopted by Caesar Augustus, who used that as a title like as emperor, right? So that term also carries with it a large amount of respect and authority, which I think Eastern Orthodox people often dismiss in the works of the early church fathers. So that being said, that clarifies some of the terminology. Now I'll go into some specifics about like things in the early church that I would think designate church authority. So, or Bishop of Rome authority. So I think that there's three instances that I'll like focus on since we don't have that much time. So the first would be the Pope Victor the First controversy. So he was Pope in, what was this, like 180, like 189 or something. And there was a dispute in the Eastern Church over when Easter was, right? Like different churches disagreed on when Easter was and when it should be celebrated. And the Bishop of Rome actually intervened and excommunicated all of the churches who disagreed with the Roman position on when Easter was. And the Bishop of Constantinople accepted this ruling, even though he disagreed with it, as he respected the authority of Rome. So I think that is very clearly showing Rome has a special authority over even the Bishop of Constantinople. The next one that I would like to talk about is just the early councils in general. You'll notice that at all ecumenical councils, the Bishop of Rome is present and given a special place of authority over the council. One common argument I've heard is like, oh, well, in Nicaea, Rome wasn't even there. And that is true to an extent. There were papal legates there. However, that's a mischaracterization really of what actually happened. And you'll find that in all of the councils, that authority is present, right? Like the council isn't ecumenical until Rome approves it, and specifically until the Bishop of Rome like orchestrates it throughout the entire church. And then I guess I don't know how much time do I have left. Sorry, I don't want to
30 seconds.
Okay, and the last thing I'll talk about is the formula of Pope Saint Hermisdus, which is basically, I'll post the document in chat, but it's basically a papal document from the early church that kind of affirms the claims of papal supremacy and is respected. Saint Cyril accepts this as fact, who is the Bishop of Constantinople. And when dealing with, because the Bishop of Constantinople at the time was an historian, and to deal with that, he wrote to the Pope asking for his permission to excommunicate the bishop. So again, we see clearly that even in the East, they are asking for permission and using Roman authority in order to enact in matters of the church hierarchy. So
All
with
right,
that, I'll
that's
just
time.
close my case. Yeah.
All right, perfectly timed. So, Trey, if you go over, you can still finish your sentence, so I won't cut you off. All right,
Okay,
go ahead.
appreciate it. Okay, thank you for that, Toby. First of all, yeah, I agree with a lot of what you were saying about how certain Orthodox polemics against the Roman Catholic view of the papacy go too far. When there is language in the early church about the Pope being first among equals and having a primacy of honor and all that stuff, these aren't just cute terms. Like, they do actually have a specific meaning. And I mean, you didn't mention this, but even if you read the ecumenical councils, the canons and the acts of the councils, language like Rome is the archbishop of all the churches, and Rome is the holy head of the church. This is all used in the ecumenical councils. So my goal in this discussion isn't to refute that language or anything, but sort of to explain how we as Orthodox would interpret it, because my contention is that the undivided church of the first millennium didn't take the Vatican I view or interpretation of this language of primacy. And so a few examples I would point to is the first is the rebaptism controversy. Now, first of all, I think that in general, Pope St. Stephen was correct in the rebaptism controversy, although there is some stuff about how he was accepting the baptism of Gnostics, which that's not what the church ended up going with. So I'm not saying St. Cyprian was completely wrong in the controversy, but in general, the Pope was correct. But what's important is that, one, the way in which St. Cyprian and the bishops that followed him related to the Pope, to me, there is no sign that they saw the Pope as having some sort of especially unique primacy among the churches so that he could dictate the manner of reception that the bishops in Carthage, for example, were going about accepting heretics returning to the faith. And also, what's important to note is that Vincent of Lérins, in his Saint Vincent of Lérins, in his Commoditorium, he talks about the rebaptism controversy, and he talks about how Pope St. Stephen was, in general, he was correct, and St. Cyprian was deviating from the tradition of the apostles when it came to rebaptism, but there's no mention of some special charism that Pope St. Stephen has by virtue of being the successor of Peter or being the Pope of Rome. Vincent of Lérins just mentions how it's contrary to the apostolic faith, and then he gives a pretty famous criteria of what constitutes the apostolic faith, and he talks about his criteria is I'm going off of memory here, so forgive me, but it's what is basically what's been passed down from, so what's in the tradition, and what is accepted by all. And there's another one, but it's not the papacy. So there's another one, but I'm forgetting. Yeah, so that's the first example I would point to of how I don't think the papacy was in the early church was understood as having some definite authority where whatever the Pope says goes. And I think the rebaptism controversy is a good example of that. Another example I would point to is the Council of Sardica, because as I was saying at the beginning, the language of primacy and how Rome is the archbishop of all the churches, this isn't just meaningless flattery. Like, there is a real meaning of it. And I think the limits and the extent to which the Pope has authority over the church is sort of given in the Council of Sardica, where, if I'm remembering correctly, he is given the prerogative to hear appeals when he is appealed to, so he can't just insert himself within controversies in different jurisdictions, but when there is a controversy between two bishops, or even within a jurisdiction. I'm not sure, but when there's a controversy that isn't being there's no progress is being made, they can appeal to the Pope and he can have some sort of authority in it. But what's crucial is that he can't just impose himself in it. He has to be called upon. And there are limits to what he can do. Like, yeah, there's no mention of how the Pope can just, he's the one ordaining every single bishop in the whole church, like the way Rome functions now. So last thing I'll say is that when it comes to Rome being the archbishop of all the churches, I think that this is really important language because if you actually look at the way the archbishop is understood, if I'm remembering correctly in the canons of the Holy Apostles, the archbishop does not have the same power over his archbishopric as an actual bishop does over his bishopric. There so it's not the same sort of symmetrical power there. There are different, he plays a different role within the church, and that would go into sort of a Eucharistic ecclesiology where the bishop is sort of is the fullness of the church, and then the communion of all the bishops together constitute the Eucharistic communion, the church in totality. But yeah, that's basically all I wanted to say, just to introduce my position. Just maybe to summarize again, I'm not opposed to any language of primacy and honor and all this stuff, and I don't think it's just empty language. But I do think if you look at the way the church in the first millennium understood this language, I don't see what is the type of authority that's given to the Pope at Vatican I.
Thank you, Trey. That's perfect. Actually, right on time. All right, so now we're going to move to a cross-examination period. So you guys will basically just get to ask each other questions. Each person gets one question, an answer. The answers can have multiple parts, but just an answer, and then we'll try to just stabilize a back and forth here. I went ahead and flipped a coin on my phone to determine who would get the first question, and it was you, Trey. So
Okay.
10 minutes starting on your first word.
Okay, so I don't want to I'll ask a different question if you haven't heard of this document before, or just what I'm talking about. But and I'm saying that because I haven't read the formula of Pope Hormisdas. So
Yeah.
yeah, in the Fifth Ecumenical Council, if I'm remembering correctly, there is an issue with the three chapters document, which I believe was accused of being I don't know. It doesn't matter, but it wasn't accepted by, I believe, Emperor Justinian, and it ended up being rejected by the Fifth Council. Now, the Pope, I believe it was Pope Vigilius, he accepted the three chapters. And in response, I believe he was jailed. So they treated him very poorly. Like they shouldn't, if he's the right guy, they shouldn't have treated him that way. Whatever. But I mean, we all believe as Orthodox and Catholic that the ecumenical councils are authoritative and inspired by the Holy Spirit. And the fathers at the council directly to the Pope, like in response to the Pope trying to unilaterally accept the three chapters for the church, they say that no matters of the faith can be decided by one person alone, and that and they appeal to the
Trey, I'm
apostles have
sorry.
done.
Trey, I'm
Sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
Is there a question here
Yeah,
though?
yeah, yeah.
If you want
Sorry, sorry.
to make arguments, you
I
have to
got
do it in speech. Yeah, go ahead.
Gotcha. So basically, how would you understand in the Fifth Council where they basically tell the Pope, like in response to the Pope trying to accept the three chapters, they say that one bishop can't just accept stuff for the whole church, but you have to do it. Matters of the faith have to be decided in a conciliar setting.
Sure. So I have not actually heard this before, but I'm reading about it right now. So I think I actually have heard something about this before. So first of all, I would say that the Pope clearly I don't think is like decreeing this ex cathedra. Like this would not like the Pope saying that this is a good idea, right? In this case, does not meet the Vatican I right line of like it being ex cathedra and it being infallible. So I think like you could easily just say like this isn't like you could just walk this back like just because one pope says that this is probably a good idea, right? Um, doesn't mean that it's necessarily infallible. I also think that time is very like important when we're talking about these things, right? Like it's one thing for a document to come out and somebody to see and be like, okay, this looks kind of good. But then once it's clear like what the intentions for those were, right, things might change. So, and also to clarify, you're talking about at the Council of Chalcedon? I'm sorry, we Catholics don't say like first, second, third, fourth, fifth. You said the fifth ecumenical council, right? So you're talking about
Um,
Chalcedon, right?
no, that would be the Second Council of Constantinople.
Okay, you're talking about the second council of Constantinople. Okay. I'm reading into this. Sorry, I
Yeah,
want
no
to
problem. It's hard to
understand what it's
find the
actually.
canons.
So what?
Online.
So what in the three chapters is like anathema? Like what in it is actually like the cause of this?
Yeah, I believe it was accused of, I want to say monoenergism, but I don't think that makes sense because that wasn't until the Sixth Council. So I think it's the confusion of natures or something like that. That's what it was accused of, like being maybe Nestorian or something. I really don't know, but it was considered like a dogmatic issue, like an issue of Christology.
Yeah, so what I'm reading now says that the Pope was present at this council and did like ratify and sign the document. So I guess I'm confused. I'm not seeing. If you could send me a link where it talks about like
Right.
what the Pope is saying on this is bad, that would be helpful. I at first thought you were talking about the first Lateran Council, the one that like was designed to be ecumenical, but it never was because the Pope was like kidnapped by the Emperor of Constantinople.
Okay, I may have, yeah,
It
I may have
happened a lot in the early
yeah.
church, so I was confused at first what you're talking about.
I may have confused those. Yeah. Um, okay, I'm trying to find them. For some reason it's super hard to find the canons of the Fifth
Yeah,
Council,
trust me,
unfortunately.
I get it. Yeah, it's
Um,
hard.
but do you want to like maybe move on from this before I can
Yeah,
find it?
if
And
you want to ask
yeah.
another question, that's fine. Yeah.
Um, do
Oh no,
do I?
Wyatt, it's
Yeah.
actually your question
Okay.
next.
Oh, okay. So I guess
It's
my question would
Toby.
be, what does honor and you've already sort of conceded that those terms do mean Rome has a special place within the church.
Hmm.
What does that place look like? If
Right.
not the Vatican I understanding of papal supremacy, right? Like how can you honor someone but not listen to anything that you say? How can you recognize their authority but not listen to anything they say? That would be my fundamental question.
Yeah. So in my introduction, I mentioned the Council of Sardica, and I basically think that that is one example of what it means to have this sort of primacy and honor in the church. In the Council of Sardica, um, they give the limits, and not just the limits, but they say what role the Roman Church has in relation to controversies. I believe it's in between, like within jurisdictions, and but it may be like between different bishops. I'm not exactly sure. And basically, what they say is that when there is an issue that can't be resolved and the Pope is appealed to by one party or both, he is basically able to um, determine which direction they should go. So he's able to choose. But like, what's important is that like he can't just insert himself into a controversy that doesn't have any relation to his own jurisdiction and is not in his jurisdiction, but he has to be appealed to.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple things. First of all, I'll admit I haven't read the text of the Council of Sardica, but it's not an ecumenical council, right? It's a regional council.
Hmm.
So I think to elevate it to the level of like everything it says is true, we can't do because it's not ecumenical, right? It was simply a regional council.
Well, I would.
Second of all,
Okay, go ahead.
I
Sorry.
would just ask, so if that is true, then how do you explain like the whole Pope Victor situation where this is the early church and the Bishop of Rome is excommunicating Eastern church members who refuse to acknowledge Easter being on the right day, right?
Sorry. Could you ask that again?
Yeah. So in the 189, right? So we're
Mm-hmm.
talking super early.
Mm-hmm.
Pope Victor I excommunicated a ton of Eastern churches which refused to recognize Easter on the same day as like what Rome was saying it should be on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this was these excommunications were recognized and affirmed by the West. So how do you if it's an overreach of Rome's authority, right, to get involved with, not their matters and not their region, why are these excommunications being affirmed? Even when like most Romans kind of disagreed with that, then that was a step too far, right? Why is the East affirming it then?
Um, I admit I am not familiar with this historical controversy, um, but yeah, honestly, I'm not familiar enough with it. But
Okay, that's fair.
yeah, I can't really comment on that.
Okay, gotcha. And so when did this special honor or privilege or whatever, you want to call it go away? Like when did Rome stop having any authority at all?
Well, over the Eastern churches, the authority it was basically at the Great Schism, but just because
No,
that's
but
kind of
like
how it
like
works
why though,
canonically.
I guess.
Why?
Yeah.
Well, the way the Easterners understood it, like if you look at what I believe Saint Simeon says about it, it's because they deviated from the apostolic faith, and then there was the break of communion over that. Yeah,
Okay, so specifically the filioque, I'm assuming that's what you're talking about.
yeah, that was the main issue
Okay.
at the time. Yeah.
Okay, so obviously that's a separate conversation that we can't really get into right now.
Hmm.
But it just seems to me like there are several instances throughout the early church, and I would encourage you to read the the formula of Hermistus. I think is a pretty compelling argument that pretty well establishes papal supremacy. Um, I guess the other question that I would ask. Oh, okay. So at what point did Rome not be needed for ecumenical councils, right? Like in all of the early church councils, we see Rome and the Bishop of Rome being given a special place of authority, right? Like leading the councils. At what point does that just go away and we just don't care what the Bishop of Rome says anymore and that's like irrelevant?
Um, that's a good question.
Trey,
Yeah,
we'll give you the last minute to answer that.
sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not 100% certain, but I would probably say after Florence, because that's kind of when the schism really became defined. Because it, like Mark of Ephesus, if the Roman Church would have, if it would have gone well, that would have been considered an ecumenical council for the East as well. But yeah, like I believe that all of the patriarchates were necessary in order for there to be an ecumenical council. And after the the Pope schism from, or as we understand it, schism from the Church, it was no longer necessary for the Roman Church to be for there to be a pan-Orthodox council because he is not one of the patriarchates anymore, like canonically recognized. So yeah.
Okay, guys. So, thank you for that exchange. Now we have the first speaker. So that was you, Toby. We have you for your 5 minute rebuttal. So I'll go ahead and start when you start.
Sure. So I think starting off, like as I mentioned in my last speech, I think these terms are extremely important when we're understanding what the role of the Bishop of Rome actually plays. So what he said in his speech was that, like, look, it's only an archbishop. An archbishop doesn't have that much authority. And I'd like to push back against that a little bit because it's not just an archbishop, right? Like even in the First Council of Constantinople, we see the power given to the Bishop of Constantinople is related to the Bishop of Rome, right? They say we're elevating the power of the Bishop of Constantinople second only to that of Rome, right? Like that
Mm-hmm.
obviously implies Rome has authority even in the East, even in these matters which quote unquote don't concern them, right? Like the First Council of Constantinople wasn't even declared ecumenical until 400 years later when the West actually affirmed it, because up until that point, it was like rejected by them because it made a couple claims that like Alexandria and Rome didn't really like. Um, and again, as I mentioned with the Pope Victor incident, I think you see excommunications of Easterners, which the East affirmed. Uh, I also think that like the whole Saint Cyril situation, sort of as I mentioned, right? Like the Bishop of Constantinople was an open Nestorian, and so Saint Cyril petitions Rome in order to excommunicate him with the authority of Rome, right? Like he doesn't just excommunicate him and be like, "Oh, you're in my patriarchate, right? So I'm going to excommunicate you." He first, before he does anything, petitions Rome and asks the Bishop of Rome and the Pope for his advice, right? That seems very telling to me. So I guess I'll talk about what my opponent talked about now. So, the Council of Sardinia thing, this is a regional council. So, again, to try and conflate ecumenical councils with regional councils is pretty silly because ecumenical councils bear the full weight and truth of the faith, whereas regional councils can be flawed, and many of them are, and say some things that we as Christians don't affirm. So, the idea of citing a regional council as authority, I think, is kind of silly. As for the whole rebaptism controversy, I think if anything, this proves the supremacy of Rome, and of the bishop, because if you actually look at what happened, over time, those bishops ended up being replaced because as he mentioned, right, like the Pope was objectively correct in this situation and sort of defined fundamentally what the sacrament of baptism was. And this was eventually accepted by all the churches, right? So to say that, oh, well, some bishops at the time didn't accept that, I don't think that actually disproves papal authority. I think it actually proves it because they all eventually conformed, right? Like you could say, like, Arius was a bishop at one point, right? Who, like, denied what the Pope was saying. Therefore, but does that deny papal authority? I don't think so. You just have bad bishops. And the last thing I'll say about the archbishop thing, I think this is going to be a key argument in this, is if you actually look at the language that is being used in the document, he's citing the First Council of Constantinople, which the third canon is what is the one that talks about this. And that canon, like I said, was rejected by both Rome and Alexandria because at the time, Alexandria was the second see, and they got really mad that Constantinople was trying to like take the position of the second see above them. So I think that the language being used there is very politically charged, and the First Council of Constantinople was called by the Eastern Roman Empire, and the bishops there like really kind of wanted to put themselves in a bigger position of power, so they used this language, which was rejected at the time. And that is all to say. Again, the question is just what is honor, right? Like, what does the first among equals mean? And my opponent didn't really push back on that. He kind of conceded, like, yeah, it does mean that Rome is in a special position of authority. So the question just becomes, okay, what does that authority look like? And I think that I've illustrated with these various instances in the early church that the Pope did, in fact, intervene in these matters and did, in fact, affirm things. And his affirmation was important, right? The Pope was present at all of these early church ecumenical councils. And his affirmation of the council is actually what makes it ecumenical in the first place. So I think that, it's very clear given that papal supremacy is the only thing that makes sense because, like, what's the alternative, right? Like, if all these early church fathers are saying Rome has special privilege, Rome has special honor, what does that mean if not the authority that is given to them in the church, right? Like, what else could that possibly mean, right? And I think that, as I've shown, the Pope doesn't really have borders. Like, he was excommunicating people in the East, North Africa. There were lots of instances in the early church which would I think demonstrate papal supremacy. So I think that's pretty clear. I think that again, so like my opponent brings up a
That's
regional
that's
council.
that's
Yeah. Okay.
actually time, Toby.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
So yep, good timing again.
Right.
So now Trey, 5 minutes to respond to anything that was brought up in questions or in any of the speeches.
Right. Okay, yeah, thank you. One thing, I mean, this was pretty like last minute. One thing, if I could have prepared for this, I would have like looked into the history of excommunications because, like, and I guess I will after this because, I'm not going to say that this is the case, but wouldn't be surprised if like the bishop of or the patriarch of Alexandria and of Constantinople and other patriarchates were excommunicating people in the past. And I also wouldn't be surprised if Rome had excommunicated people in the past and it just wasn't accepted by the church. Now, I admit I'm not like, this isn't an actual argument, but like, I just going to point out that I didn't really have time to prepare for that. But the issue of, yeah, Rome being the archbishop of all the churches, you say that it's more than just being the archbishop. But I mean, that is the language of the ecumenical councils. They say he's the archbishop of all the churches. And again, I haven't read this document in a while, but the canons of the Holy Apostles, that kind of details what the prerogatives of, if I'm remembering correctly, what the prerogatives of the archbishop is in relation to the bishop. And it's not a one-to-one authority. Like the bishop does have the type of authority in his jurisdiction that the Catholic Church says that the Pope has over the entirety of the church. That's true, but I think it's kind of important to note that, I mean, he's called the archbishop, and the archbishop does not have the same authority over the bishops under him that the bishop has over the priests within his jurisdiction. Now, yeah, the Council of Sardica is just a local council, but I mean, it is accepted, to my knowledge, by the entire church, and like that was just an example of what it would mean to talk about actual prerogatives and authority that the Pope had in the early church. And I mean, the crucial point there, and I know you haven't looked at it, but I mean, the crucial point to me is the fact that it explicitly basically says that the Pope can't just impose himself within controversies when he's not called upon by one or more of the parties involved. Now, with the rebaptism thing, I think kind of the problem with that is that, yeah, the Pope was, generally speaking, he was right, although I would, again, like I said, in a qualified way, because there were, at least Cyprian seems to have been accusing him of accepting the baptisms of Manichaeans, and that was not accepted at the Council of Nicaea, so, or the Second Ecumenical Council, whatever. Like, if, again, I would appeal to Vincent of Lorraine, who is he's a Western saint, talking about this issue. There's nowhere in that document does he say that there's any mention of papal authority or papal primacy as relevant to who was right in this, or who had the authority to determine the manner of reception, because he just says that Cyprian was deviating from the tradition passed down from the apostles. So he appeals, as the Orthodox tend to do, to the tradition of the apostles as authoritative in this manner. Now, this isn't you didn't talk about this in your in what you were just saying, but earlier I mentioned the Fifth Council of Constantinople, and so I posted the link to it. Actually, I found it on the Papal Encyclicals website. It's like the only one that seems to have this document. And so, in response to Vigilius, the fathers at this council say that in response to his attempt to unilaterally accept the 3 chapters on behest of the entire church, they say the truth cannot be made clear in any other way when there are debates about questions of faith, since everyone requires the assistance of his neighbor. And yeah, so sorry, I should have read before. They're talking about how it needs to be set out. Disputed question is set out by each side in communal discussion, so in a conciliar context. And then they quote Solomon, the Proverbs: "A brother who helps a brother shall be exalted like a strong city. He shall be as strong as a well-established kingdom." Again, in Ecclesiastes, he says, "Two are better than one, for they have a good reward for their toil." And the Lord himself says, "Amen, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything, it will be done for them by the Father in heaven." So this is response to Vigilius trying to accept the 3 chapters. Now, I get your point about how this doesn't meet the Vatican I or the Roman Catholic understanding of an ex cathedra statement. That wasn't really my argument. My argument has to do with the language used about how the fathers say in the Ecumenical Council that the truth cannot be made clear in any other way than a conciliar context when there are debates in the church about questions of faith. Now, I think this has direct implications for how we should, whether or not we should accept the idea of ex cathedra statements, and whether some sort of special charism is even possible for the Pope when he speaks from the See of Peter to make infallible statements. Because it seems to me that the Council Fathers are explicitly saying that this is not even possible, given the fact that these sorts of issues in the church can only be reconciled when there are questions of over the faith. But from my understanding, within the Roman Church, it would be at least like legally
Right, that's
possible.
time.
Just finish my sentence. Canonically possible
Sure.
for the Pope to just unilaterally decide an issue when there's a debate in the church without any appeal to the bishops. Not to say he would do that, but to me it seems like that's legally or canonically possible to happen.
Sure. Thank you. So now we're moving into a longer cross-examination. So each of you can ask 2 consecutive questions if you want, or after you answer a question, you can, hand it off to the other person to start their questioning. So 20 minutes. Go ahead. Oh, and sorry, let me do this real quick. Troy gets the first question.
Yeah, I guess I would just kind of ask you again, like, just maybe, I know you haven't looked into this, but just at face value, how would you interpret this statement here that I sent into the debate discussion channel about the father saying that the truth can't be made clear in any other way when there are debates about questions of the faith except in a conciliar context?
Right. So first of all, I would say that that's not actually what they say. Like at the very top of the document, it sort of makes it very clear what happened in the situation. Right? Was the Pope initially expressed like, "Hey, maybe these 3 chapters might be cool," and then the Council said, "No, this is bad," and then the Pope issued a constitution which he affirmed the Council, and thus making the Council ecumenical. So I think that like the idea that like I think the way that you're painting it is like as if the Pope was accepting something heretical and like teaching it in some way, or like trying to affirm it in any like real way, which clearly isn't the case, right? He stated an opinion which clearly was not ex-catholic because it was not teaching, and then walked it back and said, no, actually you guys are right. And again, I don't see anything in this council where it says the only source of truth can be an ecumenical council. I just don't see that in this text.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And I guess I would then go to the Archbishop question. I'm just going to
Sure.
read, if you would allow me, just a few sentences from Apostolic Canon 34, where it's talking about the bishops and how they should relate to their head. Now, the head is in reference to the Archbishop, and it says that they say that the bishops of every nation must acknowledge him who is first among them and account him as their head, and do nothing of consequence without his consent, but each may do those things only which concern his own parish and the country places which belong to it. But neither let him who is the first do anything without the consent of all, for so there will be unanimity, and God will be glorified through the Lord in the Holy Spirit. Now, I know that the way historically the papacy has dealt, even after Vatican I has done things, there hasn't just been the Pope going on this like crusade against the bishops and
Yeah, yeah,
deciding
yeah.
things. But to me, the problem is more so about the fact that it seems that this would be canonically possible and acceptable for the Pope to do this. So my question would be like, how would you square this with the apostolic canon saying that the archbishop can't act without the consent of all?
So first of all, the wording does not say archbishop. So I would just say right off the bat, like I think that you're confusing 2 terms, which, while they sound similar and may have similar applications in one context, do not have in this case, right? So as I cited in my first like speech or whatever, I think there are several instances in the early church where the Bishop of Rome and the Pope is intervening in affairs not within his own diocese. He's excommunicating people in the East. He's declaring that heretics in the East like cannot receive sacraments or whatnot. Um, when the Bishop of Constantinople was Nestorius, right? Saint Cyril went to the Pope and asked him for advice, and then the Pope gave him the authority to excommunicate the Bishop of Constantinople, right? So again, I think that there is a very clear pattern in the early church where when it comes to issues of authority, Rome is being consulted. And I don't think that's an accident. I don't think you can write that off as like, oh well, that's the only person they could go to, because that's not true, right? Um, and so I think those instances that I just highlighted would illustrate pretty clearly that in the early church there was a special authority given to Rome, even not in their own borders, because Rome was consulted in these cases, and their authority was the last say when it comes to lots of these administrative issues that we're talking about, when it comes to like bishops and stuff, right?
Right. Yeah, but I would just appeal again to the Council of Sardica, where I don't see any contradiction there. Like Cyril appealed to the Pope just in the same way the Council of Sardica says that when there are issues that are not being resolved, they can appeal to the Pope. I would say that kind of just supports my point that the Pope just can't unilaterally insert himself into these issues, but has to be appealed to.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I don't think you can cite your regional council in this debate at all. Like, I can show you parts of regional councils that are like blatant heresy, right, and have been like anathemized. So regional councils are completely fallible.
Um, so Toby, I think something that's relevant there to clarify this exchange, though, is that I believe Trey is making the claim that the Council of Sardica was received ecumenically at a later point. Trey, is that correct?
I believe it. I believe it was, but like I'm not going to say it has the same authority as an ecumenical council. But more so, I just think this is an example of the way the undivided church of the first millennium understood the papacy. So I don't think it should be just discarded. So, I mean, if you have an ecumenical council that says something that kind of not contradicts, but maybe gives a more
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
inclined.
So
I'm inclined to agree with that. So, Toby, how would you answer this question of sort of like sometimes there are councils that, strictly speaking, are not ecumenical, but it doesn't seem reasonable to just kind of group them into this wide category of the not
yeah,
ecumenical
yeah,
councils,
exactly.
as though it doesn't have. So the vast acceptance of this document. I mean, how do you interpret or receive that in terms of like the life of the church
Yeah, yeah,
historically?
absolutely, absolutely. So I would say two things. I'd say there's two questions you're asking. One, where is the authority of Rome in the ecumenical councils? And two, why can we like just not look at these regional councils? So I'll answer the regional councils one first. So generally speaking, regional councils that have like say something that is actually very true are accepted later in ecumenical councils, right? So whenever there's a regional council that is actually like super important and says things, you'll see it be incorporated into a later ecumenical council. For example, the Council of Chalcedon, right? There were several regional councils before, and people were like, wow, this is actually important. So they put it into the Council of Chalcedon documents, right? So I would say that in like obviously for Roman Catholics, the Council of Toledo is the first document that talks about the filioque in any like defined context, right? But that's a regional council. We don't affirm that is true. We say it's true because in the Council of Florence, they incorporated the Council of Toledo's teachings and formalized the teaching of the filioque. So I would say regional councils often lots of the things they say are incorporated into ecumenical councils, but by themselves they bear almost no authority. And so, as to the point about like where is the stuff about Rome in the ecumenical councils, I mean, I would appeal to the third council or the first council of Constantinople. It says very clearly, it says Constantinople, the Bishop of Constantinople, has authority second to that of Rome, and then it says Alexandria is next, Antioch is after that. Right? There is a clear line of succession. And, as I mentioned before, the language of honor is used, which represents authority. Rome is the first among equals, which means they are in a senior position that has administrative authority, and that is in the Council of Constantinople I. So I think that's
So
pretty clear. Yeah.
real quick, because I think it's going to go back to this question of Sardica's reception, and this
Yeah.
is the last thing I'll say before I let the Q&A close out. But the thing about the Filioque's reception in Toledo, so it was, excuse me, in Florence from Toledo. Again, I mean, I would just highlight that it's not really that clear because technically speaking, right, Florence was received as an ecumenical council by Rome, but it's clearly not interpreted in this kind of neutral hermeneutic where we can have this tub of things that we say are in the ecumenical councils, and that's how the church has always treated those things historically. Because, like, for example, the current Eastern churches aren't mandated in expressing the filioque, and I would argue that if they sign to it on paper, but then they don't do it in liturgy, that actually shows that there's some sense in which the ecclesial and synodal, canonical, in the sense of documents, life of the church is not as important as the liturgical, right? We would say that the liturgical expressions are of the same quality of importance, I guess you could say. So, how do you interpret the fact that it clearly hasn't been received this way historically, since the Eastern churches are not made to say the filioque in the liturgy in accordance with Toledo, if it really was
Yeah.
received at this level of ecumenical authority?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, first of all, like the Catholic understanding is obviously the Eastern Orthodox are in schism, right? They deny the Council of Florence, which is an ecumenical council, which does this. And on your point about the creed being said in liturgy, I actually think this is a very good point for the Catholic position. Because the original Creed of Nicaea was edited in the Council of First Constantinople, right? Which was at first a regional council. So initially, different parts of the churches were saying completely different creeds. Some Eastern churches were doing saying the new add-ons that the Council of Constantinople dictated, whereas most of the East, actually, and all of the West, were not doing that. So that expression of the creed was not universal until far later. They actually declared the Council of Constantinople I ecumenical. So then the universal church adopted those changes. So I actually think that's a pretty compelling point for the Catholic position because again, what you see is a regional council at first initiated the change, and then an ecumenical council later affirmed the change. And there were people saying different parts of the creed during that time period, right? In the same thing, in the same way with the Council of Toledo and later the Council of Florence. So I think you see
Oh, but
a direct parallel there.
so what you're saying is essentially that the multiplicity of creeds within the Catholic communion is itself the continuation of the early church practice and the apostolic
Well,
kerygma.
yeah. So what I'm saying is
Interesting.
the
Okay.
the creed that they say in the Eastern Orthodox Church is not the creed that was at the Council of Nicaea. It's the creed of the Council of Constantinople I, where they added a couple pieces, right? So you can't. That proves that you can add to the creed, right? And it also proves that again, the expression of that faith changed over time, and there were parts that were added later, which I think would be a pretty compelling piece of evidence for the legitimacy of the filioque in the Western tradition.
And its optionality in the East, right?
Exactly. Yeah, Easter, and again,
Fascinating.
that goes back to how it's just a semantic thing. That the Greek word for proceed means something different than the Latin word.
Um,
Like Eastern Catholic churches do not say the filioque way, and that's not in conflict with what the Latins say. It's just like a
So
semantics thing.
Trey,
But
it's your
anyway,
question
yeah.
right,
next.
right. Well, I mean, just to maybe just briefly comment on that, I'm pretty convinced that the Thomistic understanding that seems to be adopted at Florence of the filioque is not really compatible with our understanding. But like the term filioque itself, I mean, I personally wouldn't. It's not my choice, but I wouldn't have an issue with it being used in the creed as long as it was understood properly. But so kind of the issue is the theology behind it. So that's sort of off point. But if can I ask a question that's sort of not related to this at all?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned, and I think it was a good point that a lot of people don't really talk about the fact that there was an issue with Constantinople trying to claim authority like as a second behind Rome when
Yes.
like this was the place of Alexandria. Now,
Yes.
Pope Gregory the Great once wrote like this was a big issue for him, and so he wrote about how there is the see of the Prince of the Apostles. I'm quoting right now. The see of the Prince of the Apostles alone has grown strong in authority, which in three places is the see of one. Now I'm forgetting what the third one. I know it's Rome, Alexandria, and
Antioch.
Antioch. Right. So I mean, how would you understand? How would you understand this? Like the see of
Oh, absolutely, yes. So he's
yeah.
speaking in terms of the universal church. Like at that time, those were the three like places in the church, right? Like where you go, and that's where like church administrators were. So he's pointing out like the universality of the church in all these different traditions. Because, you got to understand that at the time, it was kind of a big deal that you had people from Alexandria, right? Like Egyptian, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had people from Antioch, right? Like Middle Eastern, and then you had Roman former, like pagan Gentiles. So I think he's speaking more to the universality of the church than assigning specific authority in one area or another. That's how I would interpret that.
Okay. Maybe just a follow up on that because he does say that like the the see of Peter is in the three places. It's the see of
Yeah.
one. So I was just wondering if the charism of infallibility stems directly from the Roman Church being in the See of Peter, wouldn't that imply that if Alexandria and Antioch were also equally the See of Peter, that they would also have this charism? So why don't they have it?
Yeah, so they are not, right? Like the keys weren't given to Paul, they were given to Peter, right? And that's important. So while sure, apostles founded those sees, the distinction is extremely different because the mission that was given to Peter is not the same mission that was given to Paul or the others, right? So I think there's a very clear distinction being made, like in Matthew, as to what that actually means. And that's obviously the traditional understanding of it.
But he's saying that they are Petrine seats.
Yeah, but again, that's nowhere in scripture, right? Like the keys are given directly to Peter. There's no mention of Paul or anyone else in that passage, right?
Right, but that's the issue
And
isn't whether the keys are given to Peter. It's that like there's no mention in Scripture of Rome being the successor to Peter. So I'm saying that I believe that the undivided church believed that the Roman See was, as Gregory says, in three places. In
So basically, why don't the Antiochians have that charism as well?
Right, so they're not direct descendants of the Bishop of Rome and Peter, right? Like they are not popes. They never had that title. Like I guess my pushback on that would be why was the Bishop of Rome given a unique title that only he had, right? That was carried along succession. If your understanding is correct, that doesn't make any sense. Like right? Like why didn't they call the Bishop of Antioch Pope, or why didn't they call the Bishop of Alexandria Pope? I don't think that line of reasoning makes any sense given the
Strictly
historical
speaking, they
context.
did.
Well, no, they didn't. They never used that language. I mean, they would use like patriarch, right? But that was used in a completely
No,
different
sorry.
context.
Alexandria is called the Pope, and they're called their own title includes Bishop of the Universe.
I mean, maybe they do now. That certainly wasn't the case in the early church. If you read the councils,
They've always been called Pope.
Star,
Okay,
Star,
I
we
mean,
can, I'll put you down for a section of the Q&A. We'll give them their last speeches in 5 minutes, and then we can have an extensive Q&A. I'm thinking we just
Yeah.
collapse that flex period into a Q&A.
I agree.
Yeah,
So, Toby, you have the next question.
sure. So let's see here. Okay, so I guess like obviously this has been like a reoccurring theme that I'm not asking you to comment on like the specifics, but how do you explain what looks to be like a pattern where bishops in the East are seeking authority from Rome to take an action, like with the
Right.
excommunications, with the Easter controversy, with all of these other issues?
Yeah, so a few reasons. I think the first would be that I do agree that Rome did have like a real primacy and a real authority. I believe that it's because Rome is the See of Peter. Also, there is mention, I forget who somewhere, Seraphim Hamilton is mentioned. There was also the belief that Paul was they're also a successor to Paul as well. Like Paul and Peter had a special relation to Rome. That's not exactly relevant, but another reason, though, and I think this might be the most important reason, and forgive me for my lack of historical knowledge on this, but Rome was, for the vast majority of the first millennium, basically free from heresy. Not, I mean, exactly, but in comparison to the East, they were pretty immaculate in this respect. So I think that a lot of it just had to do with the fact that there were so many bloody heretics in the East that like Cyril had to appeal to the Pope because I mean one of the most powerful patriarchs in the East was a heretic. So I think, like, historically speaking, that is probably the reason. It's because Rome was basically free from heresy for most of that time.
Okay, so what should Cyril have done if not if Rome's authority doesn't exist outside of those borders? What should he have done? Like his bishop is an open heretic. What do you do? If not petition the Pope as he did.
Well, I mean, again, I just appealed to the Council of Sardica. He did exactly what he should have done. He appealed to the Pope because...
Well, no,
Yeah.
but I'm asking you as an administrative matter, right? You have claimed bishops do not have authority outside their diocese, right? So if the
yeah.
bishop of a diocese is a open heretic, what can you do if you're in that diocese?
Yeah, you can appeal out because, like, I mean, I would qualify that statement because they don't have the same authority. Like the archbishop doesn't have the same authority that a bishop has within his jurisdiction. But again, like, I'm sorry to be repetitive, but like the Council of Sardica does say you can appeal to the Pope to resolve these issues. So in a sense, when called upon, like not like a unilateral
So
imposition, but
why
when
does
called
that
upon,
document specify the Pope, right?
because I
Why
think
can't it just be like the see of? Why doesn't it say the see of Alexandria can suffice, the see of Antioch? Why does it specify Rome?
probably because there was like a legitimate primacy that the Pope had.
I mean, again, I think that just again it can see. So I think fundamentally, it seems to me like you're conceding that Rome at one point had this authority, but then lost it with like the filioque, and they're no longer holding to the apostolic confession. Is that correct?
Yeah, but also like it's not the same authority that you have in Vatican I because like it wasn't an
Well, it,
authority
it
to
just seems
just
to me like you're
That's really
kind
the
of
central disagreement is the
yeah.
demonstration of the Vatican I papacy.
Yeah, but it seems to me like you're kind of like backpedaling and you're kind of saying like, oh well, sure they had authority in all of these administrative matters, right? but they don't somehow in these other matters. Like it just doesn't really seem to make any sense to me in the way in which, like, how is what the Pope doing here not in line with Vatican I, right? Like he's excommunicating people in the East. He's being consulted for all of these issues. That seems to me like exactly the same way the church operates today, right? I just don't see any conflict between the two, I guess.
Well, a few things. I would be interested to see if Star or anyone else has any knowledge on the excommunication thing, because as I said, like this is just kind of a lacuna in my understanding here. But in terms of like whether or not it is consistent with what is actually occurring today, I mean, like you don't see in the early church the Roman bishop like being the one who sorry ordains all the bishops in the church, and
Okay,
you
yeah, so
don't.
this is actually an important point I want to touch on real quick.
Sure.
So yes, the process of ordaining bishops has changed, and that has changed in multiple ways. If you actually read the canon text, I believe it's the Council of Ephesus. I think that's like the fourth for you guys. The text literally is talking about how, due to the fact that like the travel is such a big problem, we are saying the bishops ought to be ordained in this way. So the qualification given in the council for how bishops ought to be ordained is dependent upon like the situations of the current time, right? Like because they couldn't travel super far, right?
I'm
And it was a massive
Wyatt.
problem. Yeah.
Okay, so
Sure.
it's yeah. So you're basically saying it's historical and
Yeah.
based in the
Right.
limitation. Sure. All right.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
mean,
Thank you.
oh, are we going to closing statements now, or are we
Yeah.
not doing
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, and then we'll just immediately open up to questions, and
Cool.
I can make it shorter if you want, just for time, and we can give each of you guys 3 minutes. I think we should do that just to
Yeah, it's
wrap it up.
Toby's choice. I probably don't have anything more to say than
Yeah,
three
honestly, I
minutes.
think going right into Q&A might be
Q and
the
A is
yeah.
preferable. Okay, let's do that. So it seems like it was leaning that way anyway because we want to get
Yeah.
other people. And so I'll just say that in terms of just takeaways, I think for everyone to keep in mind as we move into Q and A. I will say, Toby, I don't think that there was necessarily backpedaling on the question of the authority because Trey was very clear from the beginning that we think that some Orthodox critiques go too far, just reducing the papacy to pure Byzantine flattery, which isn't accurate. I would say that something that I think we both noticed, but maybe I struggle to express, was it seems that there is, and I want to give you a chance to clarify this, or to
Yeah,
some,
sure.
or to, for someone else to, turn this into a question. If they relate to it, essentially, it seems that there's kind of a weird canonical hermeneutic here, where you're saying that it is the Pope's affirmation which causes the council to be ecumenical, and it's just kind of like, at least to me, it's almost like this like kind of invisible Platonic canonicality, if you will, where it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. Like we don't know if it truly is an ecumenical council, even if Rome receives it, because they might pull it back, or it might be turned out that the Pope wasn't speaking ex cathedra, and so it's not there isn't really like kind of a clarity, I guess you could say. And I think that it's not true that it's only ecumenical once the Bishop of Rome says it, because you have examples where the Bishop of Rome accepts it as ecumenical, but it's not accepted by the rest of the church until later historically. Chalcedon would be an example of that, like the Middle Eastern acceptance of Chalcedon between the 4th and the 5th century. And I think that it's all going to come down to case examples like that, like specific examples of canons like that, or to this question of Sardica, which keeps on coming back. I think by the end of this debate, it's basically an open question on whether or not this is universally accepted to the degree of being ecumenical in kind of a functional way. And it's really going to go back to what degree we're trying to read our paradigms back into history, for me. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it to Q&A. We'll take our first question if that's cool with the two of you guys.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
Can I just say something about that real quick? Because that was like you asked for like clarification for what I was saying on that. So can I just say something real quick?
Yeah, we can take that as our first question, I guess. So first
Yeah,
question
sure.
from me.
So I think a couple things. The question of like when a council is accepted as ecumenical, I would say is entirely circumstance dependent, right? So like obviously, if a council is happening in the Far East, the news doesn't even get back to Rome with any clarity until far later. So that explains the gaps. Like for example, the first council of Constantinople wasn't even accepted. It was a regional Eastern council, but it wasn't even accepted by the East until like 500 years later, right? So this idea that like somehow because it isn't affirmed instantly kind of disproves its ecumenical status isn't true. And also I would say you mentioned that like the Pope has like walked back an ecumenical council. That has never happened. There has never been a time where a Pope has affirmed an ecumenical council and then walked it back. So that is something that hasn't happened. There have been instances where the Pope has said, "Hey guys, let's have an ecumenical council," and then he was kidnapped on the way there, right? So the council never actually happened. However, there has never been a time where the Vatican has walked or the Pope has walked back an ex cathedra statement or declaring something an ecumenical council. So I just wanted to clear that up. I'm 100% certain has not happened. So
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you for that, for accepting my question and for that
yeah.
clarification. I would just say it'd be kind of confusing when we're trying to lay it out historically because it kind of ends up looking like the Pope is so awesome, he can change anything, even what he can and can't change, because the Pope can change anything. And it's just kind of like difficult to track, but I'm not necessarily saying that that means your position isn't true. I'm just saying that it
Oh,
definitely
it's
opens
certainly
it opens one
yeah,
up to arguments for why it's not. But thank you for
yeah.
accepting my question. The next question will come from Maddie. If he's here, it looks like uh, he isn't, but I will take a look at the chat and see what it says. So this is from Maddie, who said that the Fifth Ecumenical Council, he says, this is of particular importance because Pope Vigilius had privately agreed to the condemnation of the three chapters, but had publicly refused to condemn them and later issued a decree, the Constitutium, excommunicating anyone who anathematized the three chapters. So Pope Vigilius, it seems, excommunicated those who anathematized the chapters. The council then suspended the Pope from office and used the fact that he had privately agreed to their condemnation to pass the edict condemning the three chapters. Shortly after the council closed, the Pope wrote his second constitutum, in which he had abrogated the first one and agreed to the demands of the council. The church had ultimately sided with the council not only by ratifying its acts and decrees, but by canonizing the two successive patriarchs of Constantinople that presided over the council, as well as the emperor Saint Justinian, who famously, convened the council. So, according to him, it says not only does the council use the Pope's own statements against him, but then it passes the decrees in his absence, showing his approval had already privately been given. If it then suspends Pope Vigilius from office, leaving the see of Rome vacant until the Pope corrects himself. So what do you say to his sort of layout of those historical happenings?
Yeah, so first of all, I think there is a lot of historical context and facts that I would have to read into to like give an intelligent, well thought out response to this, right? Like again, I'm not accusing you of misinterpreting anything, but in these types of questions, there can very easily be one detail that's kind of like shifted in one way to kind of change the narrative of the story, right? And I don't know enough about this to make a comment on this. I'll give like just my initial thoughts. So first of all, it seems to me like what is going on here is the Pope initially like agrees with the council, right? And that's like declared, and then he like walks that back and then goes back, right? Or he does sort of like a flip flop. I would need evidence that what he's actually saying here would be qualified under ex cathedra or like declaring these documents good. And I don't really see that in your initial statement. But again, I would need to look into this. There were like 1,000 historical details there. And if any one of them is slightly off, and again, I'm not saying that you're intentionally doing that. I'm just saying that when it comes to complex historical events and you're talking about, oh, who said this before who said this, right? Like, due to the way communication existed, it's almost impossible for modern historians to determine whether this letter was written before this letter. So I would just say that, like, when you're dealing with a situation like that, it's very difficult to say, oh, well, we know that on this exact day, like the Pope like changed his mind or something. I'll look into that, but my initial thoughts are I don't really think that's probably fully accurate.
Okay, thank you, Toby. The next question for you as well, Toby, is more of a comment slash objection from Star. I'll turn the mic over to him, so to speak. It's on the question of the multiplicity of Petrine seats and on the question of the title of Pope being with Alexandria and other sees. So, go ahead, take it away, Star.
Okay. I have a few other questions of my own. I just wanted to point out that Alexandria has always been called a Pope, right? And when they talk of multiple Petrine sees, like with Saint Cyprian, it is said either of all bishops, all the successors of Peter, or it is said of Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome. And while Rome has a special place, it is the primate of the church. Um, I don't see Vatican I there, but that's not really the question. I have 3 questions of my own. I just wanted to ask because I'm curious about them. So, firstly, Vatican I in its dogmatic decree on the papacy, it denies the ability to appeal to doctrinal development for it, right? It says that this has always been believed by all. It's been the practice of the church continually. It's been what has been taught by Rome from the beginning, and the church from the beginning, as that would identify Rome and the whole universal church together. So would you? That's just setting up this first question. So would you agree with that, Tobey?
I mean, yeah, certainly. As I stated,
Okay.
I'll defend Vatican I as it's written.
Okay, yeah. So no doctrinal development here, but that gets us then what needs to be provided. So okay, so I'll say this. So what I noticed in this debate was you appealing to certain individual actions of the Pope, certain ways he intervened in a situation, or ways people appealed to him, things like this. But you did not demonstrate at any point from an ecumenical council. You did not demonstrate that the entire church taught the developed doctrine of the papacy. What you appealed to were situations which you could then interpret as possibly working under a Vatican I view. That's development. So it has to be explicitly taught and believed. So where exactly is this? So for example, it's like when Protestants appeal to any church figure who says faith alone, and then they say, see, it's here. See, the doctrine of the Protestant understanding of faith alone is here. But you actually have to account for that entire doctrine and say that the statement by these figures meets all those conditions. So where is such a ruling by the church that actually teaches everything Vatican I teaches?
Yeah, exactly. So as I mentioned, several councils, specifically which I already talked about here, was the Council of Ephesus and the Council of Constantinople I, say that Rome has a special place of honor, a special place of authority, and is the first among equals when it comes to authoritative matters. Which, as I have argued, demonstrates that Rome does have authority on these questions.
No. Sorry, is that Vatican I teaching? No, it isn't.
I
Vatican I
think
teaching is that Rome is indefectible, infallible, that it is divine revelation, that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, he is infallible and all must assent, that no one can be saved outside of communion.
Right. So,
with the
I mean,
Pope.
does Scripture
Where
not
is all
say
this?
like the gates of hell will never prevail against the church? I think that that's just a reiteration of that directly from Scripture.
No, you need to interpret that. I'm asking for
right.
A
So
full
if we interpret that,
in the early.
We,
No,
right,
listen,
right.
listen. Wait. Let me clarify. I'm asking for a full explication of the Vatican I view in an authoritative ruling by the early church. Does it exist?
Yes, absolutely. As I already
Fair.
mentioned, like again, I think you're misunderstanding what Vatican I is actually saying. Right.
No.
First of all, is that
Okay.
okay? So it's a pretty clear syllogism, right? A, Rome has authority, right? Rome is in the prime position of authority. Okay, that's what my argument has been in regards to the councils directly say that. Okay.
Well,
and
it all turns on what authority means. That was part of the debate.
Yeah,
and
exactly,
it's not
and that's what the debate was. And
and
again, you said that I'm using these individual instances. I'm using those instances to demonstrate that the practices are in line with what Vatican I is saying. The way the Pope acted, and the way that authority was interpreted in the early church is exactly in line with what Vatican I is saying the role of the Pope is in the church.
That was not demonstrated. And it was not demonstrated
from
any single authoritative source that all of Vatican I was taught explicitly. But we can move on to my second question, and people can simply judge from the response. My second question is about understanding of Vatican I on indefectibility, where the Pope is especially given this charism of the Holy Spirit of being the one against which the gates of hell will not prevail, and preserving the absolute truth always. He is never supposed to fail. If he fails, the church fails. Where is this what is appealed to, for example, this is not what is appealed to by Saint Irenaeus when he talks about the Holy Spirit preserving the church and the tradition being preserved. That is preserved by apostolic succession, that the whole church throughout the world preserves this faith. So would you say that, on your view, the indefectibility of the church is not in fact connected to the union of all the bishops? You would say it is indeed only connected in a special charism of Rome? If so, where is this taught in the early church
So
explicitly?
first of all, I think you're kind of misrepresenting and like overreaching with your like explanation of Vatican I's what it means when it talks about indefectibility in relation to the Pope. So I think you are right that the universality of the bishop certainly plays a role of that. But again, the question just comes down to Rome is the head of all bishops. So the bishops share that. However, the Pope does then in a special way as being the head of the bishops, right? So I think that that is very
Vatican One
clear.
does. Vatican, you can say that this starts to get clarified in Vatican II, but Vatican One does not say that. It gives indefectibility, specially and explicitly, only to the Pope. It is completely based upon him.
Yeah, but I think if you read the actual text, the bishops are mentioned in a particular way in relation to that. Again, I think you're misrepresenting the text here. I think what you're doing is taking one line and being like, "Oh my gosh," right, without reading what the whole paragraph
I mean,
actually
have you read
says.
it?
Yeah.
Okay, so demonstrate your point.
I mean, if you want me to pull up direct quotes from Vatican One, I can. I would say you're the one asking the question, right? So show me the text where it says that, right? Like pull up the paragraph where Vatican One talks about that and says that, because Vatican One deals with a lot of these issues in a lot of places. So which specific area are you talking about?
So
It's
I think that this could go on and should start. Why don't we take you again
okay.
after Kronstadt's question, because he was next in line. So, from Kronstadt, question for Tobey. Is it not true both Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics accept the first 7 ecumenical councils? This necessarily includes the fourth, Chalcedon. Undeniably, the fourth is included within the first 7. Take a look at Canon 28. So his argument's going to be coming out of Canon 28 of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, or if you have a Roman phronema, I guess you only call it Chalcedon. I also believe in 7 ecumenical councils. Conclusive proof that papal supremacy is a later invention. Canon 28. Following in all things the decisions of the Holy Fathers and acknowledging the canon, which has been just read, of 150 bishops, beloved of God, who assembled in the imperial city of Constantinople, which is the New Rome, in the time of the Emperor Theodosius, in the time of Emperor Theodosius of happy memory, we do enact and decree the same things concerning the privileges of the Most Holy Church of Constantinople, which is New Rome. For the fathers rightly granted privileges to the throne of Old Rome because it was the royal city, and the 150 most religious bishops, actuated by the same consideration, gave equal privileges. I cannot read Greek. If anyone wants to type the pronunciation there, equal privileges in Greek, to the most holy throne of New Rome, justly judging that the city, which is honored with the sovereignty in the Senate and enjoys equal privileges with the old imperial Rome, should in ecclesiastical matters also be magnified as she is and rank next after her, so that in the Pontic, the Asian, the Thracian dioceses, the metropolitans only and such the metropolitans only and such bishops also of the dioceses aforesaid as are among the barbarians should be ordained by the aforesaid most holy throne of the most holy church of Constantinople, every metropolitan of the aforesaid diocese together with the bishops of his province ordaining his own provincial bishops as has been declared by the divine canons. But that, as it has been above said, the metropolitans of the aforesaid dioceses should be ordained by the Archbishop of Constantinople after the proper elections have been held according to the custom and have been reported to him. So he's basically arguing that how do you reconcile your position with Canon 28 of the
Right.
Fourth
So
Ecumenical Council?
again, historical context is incredibly key here. I think people don't understand canons and church councils are called in a response to something, right? So whenever you're looking at a canon, whenever you're looking at a council, you have to understand what it was being called to address, right? So what is this canon actually talking about? Well, what this canon is talking about is, as you know, my opponent conceded, there is a lot of heresy in the East, right? There had been bishops in Constantinople who were open heretics, Nestorian, all kinds of heretics. So what this passage is specifically in relating to is trying to sort of shore up and put in place protections specifically within the Diocese of Constantinople to prevent that kind of scandal from happening again, because that had caused, obviously, when the Bishop of Constantinople is an open heretic, that causes a lot of problems. So again, I think it's very easy to, take this completely out of context and be like, oh my gosh, it's saying all these things. But you have to realize this is written in response to the Bishop of Constantinople being an open heretic, right? So the wording that they're using here is in that context. And I think once you understand that, it becomes very clear to see they're talking about how to better hold accountable the bishop in that specific province because it's been such an area for trouble in the past.
Okay. The next question, also from comes from Kron, and then we'll go back to Star, and then one from KK Beast. Actually, let's get one from KK Beast because he's been waiting. So, question for Tobey: what exactly about the nature of Pope Victor's excommunication of the churches of Asia Minor, the Easter controversy? So he's talking about the Quattro Decimian controversy. Explicitly contradicts the conciliar understanding of the church or supports papal primacy. Thank you for the debate, by the way. Great debate, by the way. He quotes from Eusebius in On the Easter Controversy. Synods and assemblies of bishops were held on this account, and all with one consent through mutual correspondence drew up an ecclesiastical decree that the mystery of the resurrection of the Lord should be celebrated on no other day but the Sunday, and that we should observe the close of the Paschal fast only on that day only. So again, the question was, what exactly about the nature of Pope Victor's excommunication of the churches in Asia Minor explicitly contradicts the conciliar understanding of the church, or supports papal
Yeah,
primacy?
absolutely. So, in order for those excommunications to be valid, they came from Rome. That's the difference, right? Like the Eastern Sees did not want to excommunicate these people because they didn't really think it was that big of a deal, right? They were like, look, we celebrate Easter on different days. That's not really a big deal. But Rome said, no, it actually is a big deal and excommunicated them. And the East then recognized that excommunication, right? So, I think that this directly contradicts the Eastern Orthodox position because, one, it sort of refutes this idea that Rome can only operate within her own borders, right? Like, if you're excommunicating people on the other side of the planet at the time, right? That obviously implies that the Bishop of Rome has some sort of leadership in a universal sense, right? He's not just the Archbishop of Rome within his own jurisdiction. He's operating outside of his jurisdiction. So I think that contradicts this position. And the other one is again that the other bishops in the East did not agree to this, right? So the idea that the idea that the authority the Pope gets is because all the bishops agree with him, that is not found in this incident. In fact, the exact opposite is found. Almost all of the bishops advised him against this and thought it was a stupid idea. So the fact that he went through with it and that was followed to and agreed with symbolizes the importance and authority that was given to Rome, even when the bishops at the time disagreed with him. So I think for those two reasons that it necessarily contradicts the Eastern Orthodox view of primacy.
Thank you. And then this is a short question from Kron, and it's the last question that doesn't come from Star, so just bear with me. Kronstant, question for Tobey. Isn't it true that in 809 a council was held at Aix-la-Chapelle by Charlemagne, and from it 3 divines were sent to confer with the Pope, Leo III, upon the subject? The Pope opposed the insertion of the filioque, so I guess that's the subject. The Pope the Pope opposed the insertion of the filioque on the express ground that the general councils had forbidden any addition to be made to their formulary. Where is papal supremacy in 809 AD?
Yeah, so I'm reading about it right now, and what looks like to be the case was Charlemagne called a council, right? Did not consult Rome, added this in, and then the Pope said it's not valid because this hasn't been like universally recognized, right? So what you have is a secular authority calling a council saying we're adding this, right? And the bishop and Rome is like, no, you can't do that without our approval, right? Rome was not consulted in this case, so I think that issue
Just
is
to kind
very
of
clear.
actually kind of rephrase or repush that question actually, well, why would the Pope hold back this secular, declaration if it was consistent with his position and view? Like, why would he kind of capitulate or recognize the idea that the East also needs to be okay with this, or that you can't say this even though I said it? Why does he
Well,
not
yeah.
just be...
So first of all, this was before the Council of Toledo. So this is, and again, I'm reading on this right now. But again, it comes down to the fact that they are forming a council without papal authority, and it appears to me like they also had a ton of other stuff in the council about how like Charlemagne is the rightful ruler of like lands outside of his borders and stuff. So there was a lot of stuff that looks like it was thrown in there for like political prowess of himself. So I think that
Huh,
he heard that you're the Pope and you hear that Charlemagne is having his own council and like saying all this stuff, right? And your response is
sure.
no, this isn't legitimate, right?
Got it.
Yeah,
So now we're turning to Star for what I assume will be the rest of the Q&A period. We have
yeah,
about
sure,
10 minutes on the clock.
yeah, sure.
Star. Question from Star for Tobey.
Okay, thank you. So I'll ask it to Tobey first, and he can give his response, but then maybe Trey can answer too, so this isn't
Okay,
just
so question for
Tobey.
Tobey and Trey.
Yeah. All right. So here's the from the dogmatic decree of Vatican I. Says this gift then of truth and never failing faith was conferred by heaven upon Peter and his successors in this chair, that they might perform their high office for the salvation of all, that the whole flock of Christ might be kept away by them from the poisonous flood of error and might be nourished on heavenly doctrine. So this is a statement of the indefectibility of the faith being given to the papacy. It ties it in the paragraphs preceding and afterwards. It ties this in with Rome's special charism of teaching authority and infallibility, which are given to it alone and not to the rest of the church, which is why it says that Rome can speak infallibly, and this is not by the consent of or from the power of the church. Right, so indefectibility here seems to be completely a unique thing of the Roman Church, that any other bishops in apostolic succession only have a simple submittance to the Roman Church. Now, one, where can this be found, or not found, if because Trey will take the opposite view, but where can this be found as the explicit view of the early church of the first millennium, taught everywhere, always, and by all, as Vatican I argues it must be? And two, what does this mean for our view of indefectibility and how the church is constituted by the sacraments, by the Eucharist? If the entire church, its guidance by the Holy Spirit is through the Holy Spirit's indwelling of the church in the worship, sacramental worship, and this is passed down through the bishops, then how does this square with Vatican I, taking indefectibility away from this, taking it out of that context, placing it solely upon Rome? And what is the justification for this? So that's my question.
So first of all, I would say that I think the way that you're phrasing it, as if like this Vatican I's document is taking like the authority and apostolic succession away from bishops, I think is not true. I think like ecumenical councils, bishops still are like what an ecumenical council is, right, and vote on an issue. So I would say that the way that I think you're phrasing it, I think misunderstands the way that they're trying to articulate that point. So let's talk about the sacraments question, because I actually do think this is pretty interesting. So what you're saying is true, that the sacraments fundamentally are the way that this was passed down. However, as my opponent mentioned earlier with this whole baptism controversy, what the sacraments have looked like over time has changed, right? Like that's not a static thing. And there have been all sorts of times throughout history where the sacraments have been taught in incredibly wrong ways, sometimes even for very long periods of time. And I think you'll see a reoccurring theme of Rome stepping in these instances to ensure universality on this part. So I think that what Vatican I is trying to establish here is that as part of the universal church, we cannot celebrate sacraments in different ways, right? Like there cannot be a completely different understanding of a sacrament in the Church of Antioch than there is in the Church of Alexandria, right? Like that universal aspect needs to be there.
I'm sorry. I think you're confused by what I was trying to say. Vatican I doesn't say anything about the sacraments. What I was bringing it up was to basically argue about how we understand indefectibility as part of the church itself. What is its relation to the church's essay as Eucharistic community? That's my question.
Yeah, I don't understand
because nobody ever because the papacy is separated from the rest of the bishops.
It's not.
Is no longer. Yes, it is.
Okay. You can say that. That's never been the Catholic interpretation.
Vatican I applies indefectibility to the papacy alone. The bishops only have it by submission.
But that's not true, because an ecumenical council is also authoritative.
An ecumenical council has no authority above the Pope. It's only authoritative insofar as it submits. So yes, it is true.
No, I think you misunderstand the way. I think you're misunderstanding the way that dynamic works. And also, I think if you're trying to say like, oh, well, what if an ecumenical council happened like tomorrow, right, that the Pope denied? I think that's a ridiculous hypothetical, and that's never happened in history. And I mean, if it's never happened in 2,000 years, I don't think that it's a fair question.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm trying to get at the ecclesiological principles here. But I'll let you continue, and then Trey can respond, because I know he knows about the Eucharistic ecclesiology I'm referring to.
Yeah, right. So again, I don't think it's separating the church in any way. I think it's just reaffirming, as again, what I've said is found in every single early church incident that we can see, that like papal supremacy is being expressed. It's the way that the people are acting in these certain circumstances. We can see the special place of honor being given to them in the councils. I don't understand why the Pope, being the head of the church, would contradict in any way like the sacramental procession of the church in that tradition. I don't understand how that would contradict it all. And I don't think your question like even explained what that contradiction would be. I think you're just asserting it's a contradiction without actually warranting it. So
Okay, Trey, could you respond? And if I need to clarify my question again, just let me know.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and we didn't really have. I kind of hinted at it in the debate, like the whole Eucharistic ecclesiology question. Well, one thing I would point out, at a risk of being repetitive, and is this issue of the Fifth Council and how they responded to Vigilius on this matter, where and to be charitable to Tobey, I know he had his response and he hasn't really looked into it, but to me, I didn't find his response convincing, and a lot of it is because of the way they kind of present their understanding of the church and the way authority works in the church and the way they settle matters of faith. Like they just to read a little bit from it, they say that even though the grace of the Holy Spirit was abundant in each of the apostles, so that none of them required the advice of another in order to do his work, nevertheless they were loath to come to a decision on the issue of the circumcision of Gentiles until they had met together. And then they say, in the same way the Holy Fathers had followed the example of the apostles, by gathering into the intervals of 4 holy councils, following the example of antiquity, and then the truth cannot be made clear in any other way when there are debates about questions of faith. Now, from a Eucharistic ecclesiology perspective, I think this fits very naturally within it. As it says, the apostles all had the Holy Spirit. They all had authority to teach in the church, yet they were loath to come together, as the fathers say, to make a definitive ruling on the, or they were loath to just singularly decide how the church should proceed on this issue of circumcision without coming together. So, like, in relation to Eucharistic ecclesiology, even though each church has the fullness of Christ, it's only when they come together that they manifest the true fullness of the body of Christ together, and they can make infallible Holy Spirit inspired statements on matters of faith. And I just think it's pretty it kind of to me just signifies or expresses the way the early church understood the way in which matters of faith were dealt with. To me, I don't see why they would say that the truth cannot be made clear in any other way than in specifically a conciliar context, if there was this alternative way, which is just the Pope of Rome proclaiming something infallible from the See of Peter. And I would say that this, I would agree with you, Star, that this does seem to introduce some sort of asymmetry into the church hierarchy, where the Pope has some special charism that doesn't exactly make sense if, as St. Cyprian taught, and I believe can be demonstrated from the councils and just the way the church always understood itself, all the bishops had the fullness of Christ, and that's directly related to the authority they have when they come together and manifest the fullness of the body.
yeah,
So
but
that's what I'd say.
just to respond to that, I think your own example actually proves Vatican I is correct on this issue, right? If you're talking about the Council of Jerusalem, it was Peter who led the discussion, and his position, which ultimately became church teaching. So I think that to say that all bishops are equal among this, in this situation, is a complete misnomer and misses what actually happened at the council, right? Like, it was Peter who led the discussion, and his vision that was given to him by God. Specifically, I'm relating to the part where he's told about how you don't have to follow the kosher protocols and stuff of Mosaic law, right? Like, he's arguing against the other apostles, and it is his position that is accepted as the dogma and the universal teaching of the church, even when it conflicts with the other, bishops, the apostles in this case, right? Like, he's clearly at the head of this discussion.
James is the president of the council, but that gets to a very intriguing point here. So, if this is right, it's a charism. If you take it as a special charism of Peter, something granted him by the Holy Spirit, is it granted to Peter and his successors as bishops, qua bishops, or is it given to them specially as papacy? In which case, what is papacy? Is it in any way really connected with apostolic succession? Is it something that is actually handed down, or is it given from above?
It'd be the former. So
It's
the
apostolic
papacy,
succession?
yeah. So the bishop in the papacy in the sense that like the Bishop of Rome is the Pope. Like that's always been the case. So I guess I think you're trying to like conflate the position of the bishop and being the Bishop of Rome as somehow being similar to the position of other bishops. And I would argue that that's never been the case, and that role has always been entirely distinct as the successor of Peter
So he's
directly.
a super bishop.
I mean, again, I think that using this terminology can be tricky because, like, what does that mean, right? Like, what is
I'm
it?
asking
Well,
you.
if I could interject and ask a question that is the same question. So Toby, so like there's this question earlier about how Pope uh Viligius
Yeah.
Vigilius was suspended from his office and the See of Rome was left vacant. And basically, like, I think the implicit question here also goes back to Starr's earlier question about the question of the multiplicity Petrine seats and the multiplicity of Petrine charisms. It's possible that we could build like basically a hierarchy, I guess you could say, like in that source you mentioned earlier, but we don't know what that source is from, and at least I don't. Like it's not necessarily historically clear that that like hierarchy it lays out like is true. It's certainly not anywhere in ecumenical documents. So like how do you deal with the question of there being multiple Petrine seats, and does that, because we would say those who are sympathetic toward the Eastern position would say that the question of there being multiple Petrine seats allows for things like the removal of the Pope to happen. Like, how can the Pope be suspended from office unless it's part of the life of the Church that there are authority structures that permit for that?
Yeah, so I would have to look into the Pope Virgilian stuff. I have no idea whether or not it's true that he was, kicked out of office. I don't think that's actually what happened. I'll read into it and give you guys a write up later if you want. But onto the other stuff again, I think it's very clear from the writings of the Ecumenical Council that they do not share that authority, right? Like it makes it very clear in the canon of Constantinople 1. Rome is first, then Constantinople, then Alexandria, right? Like there is a very clear power structure being communicated. It never says that they are to be equally respected with equal authority. That is simply not what the council says. So, you can
Okay,
dance.
that turns on the issue of what the universal primacy is. We all believe the Pope had a special universal primacy. But anyways, this is getting away from where my question and your response have been leading to. So you said that the Pope's special charisms of infallibility and indefectibility, these are results of his ordination, so results of apostolic succession. After this, I can post in the chat several Catholic sources from Pope John Paul, I believe, and others that contradict this and say that it is in fact not from ordination. Um, but since you say it is from ordination, don't you agree with the principle that one can only give what one has received and what one has, which is, for example, why a priest cannot ordain because he has not actually been ordained with the ability to ordain?
I guess I don't understand what your question is even asking. Like,
What I'm
was
leading
there
up
was
to
there a
is
question there?
that
That seemed to just be a statement.
what I'm leading up to is that popes don't ordain popes. Popes die, and then people
Right.
there actually isn't an ordination ceremony. But you claimed this was from his special charisms were from apostolic succession.
Right.
Where is the person giving him what that person has? It's necessary for ordination.
Well, first of all, I think that this completely contradicts what you just said that there was a primacy of Rome and now there isn't. So I think that you just conceded that there is a special authority that is granted to the Bishop of Rome
No,
that
I'm
seems
working
to
on
have been
your
given to them.
principles. I'm working on
No
your
Well,
one ever,
principles.
but no one ever denied that though.
no, that's
I,
exactly my point, though. So you're saying this authority exists. Your question seems to just be like, how is that
It,
transferred?
it exists, but it's not the Vatican One would be his argument. It's not the
yeah.
Vatican One declaration,
Yeah,
and
but I
if
think
it
your
was, you would
argument
have to
is
pass
right.
Wait,
that down. But guys,
let me
we're
clarify.
we're entering sort of the last minute of the time we had allotted. Trey, I'm not sure how you want to go about this, but I will totally. I think it's totally appropriate that Star is allowed to express that question, and we get one more answer
Yeah,
from Toby,
that's no
and then we
problem.
can probably cut it off or
Yep.
um go ahead, Star.
Okay, yeah. So let me clarify. This question, it's not about our different understandings of primacy. It's specifically dealing with this issue of the Pope as a bishop or as something else. Now, Toby has taken the view that the Pope gets all his charisms from ordination in apostolic succession, and yet for many centuries, Popes have not ordained popes. Popes have died, and then popes have come pope. There's not even an ordination ceremony. There's an election. So, on the principles of apostolic succession ordination, which to my knowledge both of our churches accept, one who does not have something cannot give it.
Basically, where's the super bishop ordination?
Right.
Yeah, so you're asking like a question about like the transferring of power, which I'm not familiar with. So I don't know what the exact justification would that be. But I don't think that's relevant to anything that this debate was about, right? Like we were talking about the early church. Is there precedence for papal supremacy, right? That's what this debate was about. So I don't think what you're talking about has any relevance to that at all.
It has troubling implications for the Vatican I view.
I mean, I think you're asking like a technical question about how the Pope is ordained, right? I don't really think that has anything to do with whether or not the Pope has authority. That doesn't really seem to have anything to do with
That's
that.
the problem. The Pope isn't ordained. When you said it is from apostolic succession, he has this power.
I mean, I don't know what the official teaching is on that, but again, I don't think that's relevant to anything that we talked about because,
All right.
yeah, I don't think that is at all.
So, in conclusion, I will just restate the initial issue and resolution of this debate, which was the question of is the papacy defined at Vatican I true and the apostolic kerygma? Seems like we have concluded our discussion. Trey, I'll turn over to you.
Yeah, no, not much more to say. Thank you, Tobey. It was a really good debate. I appreciate your charity in it and kind of bearing with me. I know this is like super last minute, so I wasn't like really prepared at all. I was kind of just going off memory based on everything I've learned in my readings on the papacy. And yeah, thanks for everyone for asking questions. And yeah, there was no problems with anyone in the voice chat, which is really appreciated. So yeah, thank you.